So with that, I'm going to pass it to Alex Risley-Schroeder, who's going to be talking about specifically job creation in the Pioneer Valley.
I'm with the Massachusetts Workforce Alliance, and we, through our local food, local jobs research, identified strong regional food systems as an area with potential to create jobs. And we asked, where will the jobs be? What kinds and what preparations necessary to build a ready, skilled workforce for these jobs? These questions are really informing our work, including as one of the organizations that's working on the Massachusetts State Food Plan process. And they also inform our participation in this network. Right now, I want to talk about food jobs in our valley. And I want to talk about cautious optimism, intention, and powerful cross-cutting alliances. I want to frame our consideration today of the hands that feed us. So when we think about food and how it gets onto our plates, we might think about farmers, truck drivers, cashiers. We might think about someone preparing the food for us. But this thinking is akin to the thinking that the lights go on because of a switch on the kitchen wall. We're skipping over some of the essential steps involved in getting food from field to greenhouse to plate. And each of those steps that it takes to get food to our plate involves someone, right? And in a local food system, it involves someone we might know, someone we could know, someone we might want to know. And the thinking is that by eating more that's produced here and processed here, we can create jobs. I want to give you some perspective on this. Mass Workforce Alliance, in our research and interviews with Valley Food System businesses, affirms that job creation potential exists. Michael Schumann, in his analysis, which you had a link to his report and the invitation and publicity for this, indicates that 25% shift towards food localization would create 4,030 new jobs. For a workforce development person, that's an exciting number. I hope you're excited too. I also want to say, but be cautious here. These are the jobs that are possible. Not necessarily all of them are plausible. And that has to do with a range of constraints, including land, training, investment, and things like that. However, with that caution, I'm going to give you a scan of where those jobs might be. And think about which ones you anticipated and which ones might be surprising to you. So if there's land and training available, it could be there's new jobs in raising and slaughtering animals, like pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, poultry. There's also egg production jobs. There's a potential for new farming jobs, growing fruit, vegetables, and grains, raising nursery stock, including trees and plants. And there are also jobs in agricultural support activities. Think compost, think anaerobic digestion. And local food could also create food manufacturing jobs, frozen food, baked, and canned products. And there's a potential for a large number of jobs raising dairy cattle and the value-added work that can come with that, manufacturing milk, butter, and ice cream, and with additional demand, potential food service jobs. Show it to me again. All right. Also, if we look north to Vermont, which sometimes we do, right? They're a little ahead of us on some of this. We can see that intention can be a powerful catalyst in job creation. Vermont has, in the past 4 years, been able to create 2,162 food system jobs. Don't you love the specificity there? And I hear that it might be higher, but it's hard to keep track. And Vermont's initial estimates were 1,500 jobs to be created over 10 years. And I've heard them say that the act of making a plan and connecting and strengthening the food system through that planning process catalyzed job creation, and that they were able to exceed their initial estimates. So here, in our valley, we have good plans. We have the Pioneer Valley Plan, raise your hand, David. We have the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, Mary's over there, and many of you participated in the development of those. We have focused intention. We have invested stakeholders, including all of you in this room, and that this is good and this is hopeful. More local food can mean more local food jobs. But as much as we can be and should be hopeful, we must also be three things: discerning, critical, and active. Just because the food comes from here does not mean that the jobs are good jobs, that they're paying fair and living wages. And in many instances, local food jobs in our valley are part-time or seasonal jobs with a great deal of uncertainty for workers. And that's a big missed step in our food system. Let me give you a few more examples of missteps. This is not an exhaustive list, but we have a diversity of agricultural workers, ranging from migrant workers to college-educated workers, and each one has a different set of needs that need to be addressed. And we know that we'll need more well-qualified workers for agricultural production. So we're going to have to figure out how to address those needs and do so meaningfully. We lack clear, well-articulated, and accessible pathways that allow and support people to come in at an entry level and advance to positions with more responsibility. And the available training isn't always a good fit. And then as we relocalize, training needs to change in response to that. We have regulations like Department of Labor regulations and municipal health codes that can constrain business efficiency as well as business innovation, both key components of a functioning food system. So what can we do? What are we doing to address these missteps? Today you're going to hear a lot, but the thing I'd like to point you most towards as you listen is that one of the most vital things is that we're making and using alliances that bring workers and employers together, that bring food system builders and advocates together. And these are strategic, focused efforts to address issues that confront workers and employers. But I don't want you to be fooled, because what makes these alliances powerful is their potential to strengthen and improve relationships between local businesses and the local people they will employ. And that's the key. So my charge today was to communicate cautious and practical optimism. And so let me sum that up. Yes, we can create local food jobs, but we must be very careful and pay attention to the hands that feed us. So, thank you. I'm happy to turn the mic over to Erbin Crowell, who's the Executive Director of the Neighboring Food Co-op Association, and he's going to set this conversation about the hands that feed us in a larger context. And we're incredibly fortunate to have him here with us, and he's connected to us and was part of the early efforts around establishing this fine network. So thank you.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Alex. And thanks for the opportunity to speak with you all. My name is Erbin Crowell. I'm Executive Director for the Neighboring Food Co-op Association. I was also a staff person for the Cooperative Fund of New England. I don't know if there's a rep here today. When these dialogues were first getting started, and I see a lot of the same folks in the room. It's great to see you all and have a chance to talk with you all today. My background might be described as an obsession with cooperatives. I serve on the board of the National Cooperative Business Association. I'm teaching a course at the University of Massachusetts now in the cooperative movement. We've also got some great panelists today and other people in this room, so I'm trying to figure out in my presentation how to steer a little bit in a different direction and offer some thoughts on this question. What I want to get at is some of these questions about resilience of businesses. If we're going to be able to create strong local jobs that create good opportunities for working people, how are they going to survive over time? You know, in some of the first questions here, I know this sounds kind of straightforward, but for a job to be good, it first actually has to exist. And for a job to exist over the long term, it's got to be resilient. One way to strengthen resilience is the loyalty of the stakeholders in a community towards supporting that business over time. One of the best ways to create loyalty is to ensure that they have some kind of ownership and participatory stake in that business. And finally, what I would say is that same core lesson can also be applied to dialogues like this around what good jobs are, what they can be. How can we engage people in a way that they feel included and empowered and have a stake in the outcomes of those discussions? So where I come to this question from, I spent about 10 years working with a worker cooperative called Equal Exchange, and our focus was on creating more fair trade relationships between the global north and the global south. Worker cooperatives connecting with food cooperatives to try to create more fair trade relationships for producers and workers in the developing world. Over time, that work was extremely inspiring for me, but over time what became more and more apparent to me was those same power relationships we were seeing internationally and trying to resolve had very strong parallels right here in our own country, in our own backyard. And I started working with Equal Exchange to try to create what we call a domestic fair trade program to try to address some of these issues in collaboration with producers. And I just wanted to share probably one of the most profound experiences I had was working in Georgia in the South with African American farmers. This is Cornelius Key, who's an organizer with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which might be described as sort of the economic wing of the civil rights movement. It's a history that has largely been lost. But African American communities in the South used credit unions, worker co-ops, farmer co-ops as their primary leverage against a power system that was locking them out. It's an extremely inspiring story, a challenging story, and it's one that continues. And that brought me to an even stronger sense of the potential of cooperatives in terms of empowering working people in their daily lives. This presentation could have been all about that history. In fact, I had to work hard to steer away from that. But as I've been teaching at the University of Massachusetts on the history of co-ops, the role of working people in creating a totally different working model in the Industrial Revolution is deeply inspiring. It was union activists, it was working people who formed the first food co-ops, the first farmer co-ops, the credit unions, many of which are still in operation in our valley today, were formed by working people. And I could talk about that all day, but maybe that's a discussion for another time. And I want to try to stay focused on the question before us now. What's the relevance of this model now? So to steer back to this question of enterprise resilience, right? If we're trying to build strong local jobs, good jobs, one of the key questions we've got to address is how those jobs are going to survive over time. One of the obsessions of mainstream business literature today is on this question of loyalty, especially in the wake of the global recession. If you look at how hard businesses have to work to maintain customer loyalty, worker loyalty, the loyalty of investors, and the impact of negative relationships on the performance of the enterprise and its ability to pay workers well is profound. And when people looked at cooperatives in the context of the global recession, what they found was co-ops are actually performing much better than other types of business. But what the crucial ingredient was the ability of co-ops to leverage the loyalty of their members, whether they be consumers, workers, producers, into the success of that business over time, particularly during a down economy. And what this translates into is stronger enterprise resilience over time. The people in the community feel committed to that business, they feel empowered by that business, they feel heard by that business, and in the context of a challenging economic situation, they are more likely to either work harder for that business, or shop there, go out of their way to shop there, or in the case of producers, ensure that that business is getting their best products moving forward, because that is the way to root that infrastructure in the community. Many of you might have heard about the International Year of Co-ops in 2012. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about co-ops a lot, but I'm talking about this question of resilience through cooperatives. And what I think is significant about this is that, the UN didn't shine a light on co-ops because of the word co-ops. They shined a light on this business model because in the wake of this recession, when jobs were being lost at an incredible rate, people were losing their homes, working people were losing their life savings, there was a business model that was surviving, and it was surviving through the participation of its key stakeholders. And so the dialogue that they wanted to raise was not simply about this specific model, but how the question of participation can be built into dialogues across the economy. Now, co-ops ourselves have not been that great at telling this story ourselves. But in 2008, the food co-ops here in the Valley of Western New England actually hired an independent researcher to take a look at the impact that we were having. Alex mentioned Vermont. Our food co-ops are extremely strong in Vermont, and if you took them together, they would actually be among the top 25 employers in the state. That's a statistic that none of us realized before we commissioned this study. If you think about the questions of good jobs that Javiera raised, if you look at tenure, if you look at workplace participation, if you look at wages, if you look at staff turnover, if you look at pay ratios, in all of those areas, these cooperatives performed very, very well, and much better than we might have thought. The point I want to raise there, I should also point out in terms of sustaining other local businesses. So here you've got locally rooted businesses that make a priority of buying from other local businesses. So these co-ops together purchased over 30 million in local products. So they're leveraging their buying power to sustain other businesses. What I want to emphasize is I don't want anyone to misunderstand me and say, therefore co-ops are perfect. Therefore we've got it all figured out. In fact, what this study did more than anything was raise questions on how we could do better, how we could balance these issues with buying local, with being more sustainable. So more than anything, it continued to shine a light on what we could do better in terms of serving our local communities. To bring this to this larger dialogue, again, what I'm trying to get at is the power of these business models is the engagement of key stakeholders, workers, consumers, producers, in the long-term viability of that business in terms of how it serves its community, how it could serve its community, what its mission is moving forward. In my last couple of years at Equal Exchange, I had the chance to work with this group called the Domestic Fair Trade Association, which was trying to take these lessons from the international fair trade movement and understand how they could be applied domestically and locally. And I think one of the most powerful things we were able to do there was to pull together a broad group of the stakeholders in that system. Whether you're talking about farmers and producers, retailers, processors, NGOs, and I would say most critically, farm workers and workers in the food system. And what was most inspiring about that process is that up until that point, a lot of these groups had never been asked to have a seat at the table in defining what it was we meant by fair trade, by good jobs. And I think that there was an assumption at the time that this would be challenging, like you couldn't put all of these competing interests in one room and come up with viable solutions. But I think if you look at the principles that PVGrows is trying to work by, some of the principles that Javiera mentioned, you can see them reflected in the principles that came out of this initial working group, this steering committee of stakeholders across the food system in terms of fair prices for producers, fair wages for workers, sharing of risk and reward. Ownership is something I would love to see more at the fore in terms of thinking about the potential of workers' engagement in good jobs, not always being in a position of asking for better wages or having some say, but actually being at the table as owners, as participants in the success of that enterprise. And part of what we wanted to do is figure out how you institutionalize that dialogue moving forward. And so this slide is sort of my thumb in the eye of every PowerPoint seminar I've been to that says what you're not supposed to do with a PowerPoint slide. But the point is that this is the diagram that I presented to this group when we were deciding to incorporate on what I thought governance of this organization could look like. And it institutionalized the representation of each of these groups, not just by saying, hey, we've got a seat here for you. Each of these groups appoints their reps, right? So the farm workers organizations in this group say who they want to represent them in this dialogue. And I think initially there was a lot of fear among the different stakeholder groups that what might happen was each of those groups was going to put forward their most contentious leaders, right? Their leaders most able to fight for their perspective. And this is not what happened. Invariably, these groups would get together and they would think about the representatives that they wanted at the table. And when they appointed their reps, there was almost universal excitement among the boards on who was there at that table. And I don't want anyone to get this wrong. That is not because everybody at the table disagreed. It was that all of these very, very challenging issues were on the table, and they felt they had the right people in the room to advocate for those issues and try to come up with solutions that treated all the stakeholders as equal participants in the outcome. So if as you all move forward and think about the dialogue around good food, good jobs, and PVGrows, I'd love it if you took a look at the principles that this group came up with and see how they match up with the end point that you're trying to get at. So where I wanted to wrap up was just back to that initial question that I was raising. If what we want is good food jobs that survive over time, I feel like we really need to wrestle openly and honestly with these questions of ownership, of democracy, of empowerment. How to weave stakeholder loyalty into these economic systems that we're trying to build so that they're resilient over time, and all of the great work, creativity, and entrepreneurship that goes into creating them actually ends up with the type of economy that we were hoping to come out with at the end. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing from this panel and any questions you have.